Welcome to TalentWise, a podcast dedicated to identifying and unpacking challenges and solutions related to the workforce. Each week, we'll hear from experts in their field or industry who are fighting to better understand shifting dynamics. What are those dynamics? Put most simply, the workforce crisis we've been talking about and seen coming for decades is now upon us, and most of us aren't nearly as prepared as we should be. In our first episode, we talked about the scale and scope of our workforce challenges with Nyesha Black, a director of demographics at a large university system. She framed this problem from a statistical perspective. Put most simply, the numbers are not good. Then we heard from Jeff Lenard, Vice President of Media and Strategic Communications for the National Association of Convenience Stores. He's leading his industry's strategic efforts to address this problem proactively. This week, I am extremely excited to welcome our friend, Kim Lear, to TalentWise. Kim, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Danny.
So glad that you are here. For those listening, Kim is the founder of Inlay Insights. You might have heard her speak on NPR or read about her work and her perspective in platforms like the Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, USA Today, Time Magazine, or a host of any other places, Kim, where you have spoken and people have tuned into what you have to share. Kim is a writer and researcher who explores how emerging trends impact the future of our workforce and marketplace. She's very well known for her ability to use a mix of data, storytelling, humor, which I can attest to, and actionable takeaways to discuss the trends that most impact the bottom line of organizations. I met Kim years ago when I heard her speak at a conference, and subsequently when she was kind enough to address our team at a Mark Steen annual meeting. Kim was studying, learning, and sharing findings about the workforce long before it was cool. So Kim, thank you again for joining us today. To get started, when you were a kid, how did you get where you are today? I don't know that when you were a kid, you dreamed of being an expert researcher focused on these topics. What kind of got you into this line of work?
Gosh, I feel like a lot of people who didn't become like a doctor or a lawyer, something really prescriptive, always have topsy-turvy stories, and I am no exception there. But I did kind of develop an obsession with this topic of generations at a young age. When I was in college, Jean Twaingy, who's a phenomenal researcher at UCSD, she had written the book Generation Me, which was sort of the magnum opus of the millennial era. And it was very eye-opening to me as she was talking about my age group, and it was so real. And the changes that she talked about in terms of the education system throughout my formative years and parenting trends and messages and all of that. So I started being interested very young, and then I worked for David Stillman and Lynn Lancaster, who are phenomenal researchers who wrote When Generations Collide and the M Factor, Gen Z at Work. And I stayed with them. And so you're right. When I was a child, I wasn't like, this is my dream, because I didn't know that this was a thing. But I think as soon as I was exposed to these types of longitudinal studies, how you study change over time, how you explore what stays consistent and what changes and why it changes, I never strayed. So that's really all I've ever professionally done is study this topic.
Well, I can say I'm really glad that you have spent your career focused on this topic because, like I said, it was interesting to our team many years ago, and I think it's even more critical to understand these dynamics today and what's happening in the world. So as an expert researcher, what are the trends that you're seeing in our nation's workforce that kind of make you feel maybe a sense of urgency and maybe feel a little more positive?
Well, I think in terms of trends, and I'm sure that Nyesha, the demographer, may have addressed some of these as well. But We've been talking for 15 years about the mass exodus of baby boomers from the workforce. And there was a little bit of delay in that because of the 2008 recession, putting many of them in a financial situation where they needed to hold on to work a little bit longer. And so we kind of kicked the can down the road on that mass exodus.
Yeah.
And then, really, during the pandemic, that's where we started to see this huge exodus very quickly. And it's interesting because in 2021 and 2022, when we saw a lot of labor reshuffling, the great resignation, when I read think pieces about the great resignation, it was very focused on 21-year-olds leaving barista jobs. And obviously, that was not encompassing the whole story. And in the most recent estimates from Goldman Sachs, they believe that about 50% of the people who participated in the great resignation were over the age of 55 and have no intention of ever rejoining the workforce. And baby boomers are just huge. It's just a massive demographic. Their continued involvement in the workforce was kind of what was compensating for cliff diving birth rates. And so I think that, following that piece, that generational passing of the baton in the workplace has been a big area of interest and focus and research. Anytime that a new generation steps into that C-suite, we see some differences. We saw that between traditionalists and baby boomers as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
looking at that, Gen X's ascension into those C-suite positions, but also looking at Gen X and the oldest millennials really being in that sandwich generation. When you ask, like, what are some of the biggest things that you see? I don't necessarily know if I would classify this as the biggest, but it is kind of one of those invisible forces that is having a profound impact on people and their mental health and their capacity. Just a reminder that sandwich generation is referring to taking care of aging parents on one side and school-aged children on the other. And there were some nuances because of the pandemic, but even before that, I felt that Gen X was in a particularly precarious situation with this life stage because the illnesses ailing their parents are chronic and long-lasting, time-consuming, very expensive. And on the other side, they were the first generation of parents to navigate the teenage years with social media. And then you put a pandemic on top of it. You had elder vulnerability on one side, you had a youth mental health crisis and childcare disruption on the other. So I think when we're looking at capacity, when we're looking at the role of work in people's lives, there's something kind of profound happening right there. Looking at just from a kind of trend perspective, millennials stepping into those managerial positions, looking at the trends of millennial management, what's the same, what's different, which we can go down a whole rabbit hole there of kind of how our perceptions of good leadership have evolved. I think that's a piece that we've looked at. And then Gen Z, as well as the kind of the oldest of Gen Alpha, this is a way to this is when we talk about mental health, when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about changing family dynamics and this kind of friendship-like dynamic between parents and children. We can kind of couch that all under Gen Z and Gen Alpha, even though, of course, there are pieces of that permeate across the generational spectrum. Those are kind of some of the big trends that have been very top of mind when I'm with clients and I open it up for Q&A. There's a lot of energy around those topics.
Yeah. Well, I remember when you addressed our team and you talked a lot about the, I guess, 4 generations who currently were working together in the workforce. And to your point, with boomers exiting the workforce en masse, I think by 2030, 90% of boomers will have exited the workforce permanently. There's got to be a equal and opposite shift, I mean, for lack of a better word, culturally within the workforce and ways in which generations interact with one another. How would you advise employers to think about that dynamic, that shift?
Well, I think what I've always loved about looking at change from this generational lens is it allows us to just zoom out a little bit, because our current moment always feels the most urgent, always feels the most dramatic. And I don't want to, there are headwinds right now, and that is the truth. But you look at that baton pass between traditionalists and baby boomers, and you zoom out a little bit. 50% of traditionalist men were veterans of World War II or the Korean War. This was a generation really known for setting aside their individual needs and for the needs of the greater good, a generation of sacrifice. And because of that, and a military mindset, this real top-down command and control style of communicating. And baby boomers flooded in, and it was a huge culture shift, really focused on growth. I mean, we forget now, but when baby boomers came in and really transformed the American workforce, what this did for America's GDP, what this did for our conversations around scale. I mean, it was transformative. What it did for kind of general innovation. And so again, it's not right or wrong or better or worse, but I think it's important for leaders during times of transition like this to zoom out a little bit and be like, what have we learned from these other baton passes? What was lost that I wish we could have saved? What changed that we were worried in the moment, but it ended up being so fantastic? And so I would say that that's kind of a similar moment that we're in right now. There's always things that are lost and there are things that are gained. And I think it's really about leveraging what it is, what it means to gain right now. I think there's a lot of momentum in the workforce right now to better optimize our processes and our procedures and our norms. I think you got a lot of leaders who are also leading younger generations who are hungry for this as well, to really look at bureaucracy, look at the pace of change that is possible. I think there's a lot of momentum right now to not hold on so tightly with white knuckles to what was, so that we can build something better for everyone. And so I would say that those are the areas to really focus on, of how do we kind of show that sense of enthusiasm for these future possibilities in this very interesting moment where there are just less sacred cows. We are in, and we can talk all day about why is that and where did that come from, but I think that is the truth, that we're in a moment where people, partly because of AI, but people are very open to exploration.
When we spoke with Nyesha, we talked a lot about the impact of COVID on all of these forces,
Yeah.
and how, at least from my perspective, it was just an accelerant. It accelerated so many different things in so many different ways, but mostly it just sped things up. What is the effect of COVID on some of the issues you're talking about related to just population density by generation, and I don't know, the intercultural dynamics between generations who are working together and cohabitating?
We're not going to know some of this for so many years. And I remember even when researchers were trying to think of how exactly will 9/11 shape millennials. They were young, very porous at that time. And if you look back at the immediate writing, in between 2002 and 2005, it was wrong. It was just, we make a set of predictions, and we're so close to the moment that it's hard for us to really see straight. And so that is my disclaimer here, for if anyone listens to this 10 years from now and is like, wait, what? But there's a lot of ways in which I think it, from a workplace setting, I'll just focus on some of the things that were quite a big shift. There was such a sense of intimacy in the workplace during COVID. Part of that was with remote work, people were in each other's homes and seeing each other's kids and their animals. And so there was this barrier that had really been broken in the workplace across generations and with one and across the hierarchy. I mean, there was, and because everyone was kind of sitting together in this place of unknown, there was a lot of vulnerability. Um, Also, leaders at that time really did have to have some understanding of the personal lives of the people that they were leading, so that they could, if they needed to edit sales goals, if you needed to know, are you sick? Is someone you love sick? Do you have childcare? Do you have elder care? So these barriers were broken, and we're in an interesting moment right now where there are some real pros to that sense of humanity and that sense of teamwork. But now there's a lot of questions around like, what is the balance between empathy and accountability? And what is the balance between coaching and coddling? And once we have really swung open the doors for we're bringing our whole selves to work and you're vulnerable and I'm vulnerable and all of this, then it's like at a certain point, the rubber meets the road. There are expectations, there are goals, there are shareholders, all of these things. And so I think that is one of the ways that COVID has shaped the workforce of an explosion of intimacy and vulnerability, and now a little bit of course correction. I think that's a part of it. Outside of the workforce, but of course it impacts the workforce, is a young generation's just complete distrust for institutions. And we're not going to know for such a long time the impacts of being young, being porous, going through COVID. And I know things played out different state by state. And I think Alabama maybe went in person much faster than some other states. But remote learning had impacts on, not only now are we really able to properly measure learning losses, but also measure, like, was this the right thing to do? Like, and we can't run a control. That's the problem. But I know, a lot of young people are grappling with some of these bigger questions of institutional trust.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of that is I don't know if it's getting worse per se, depending on one's perspective, but it sure is getting, there's a lot more traffic and turbulence in that air. When I think about my kids, I almost don't know which issue to try to unpack with them, because the rapidity of everything that is happening in the world right now is just constantly in your face. Very different from, the childhood that I had, where news happened when you actually tuned in and in very few outlets. So as you think about some of the forces at play that we've discussed so far, and then you kind of consider, a lot of our team's work is focused on talent attraction, trying to get people to consider jobs and career paths that they otherwise might not have or might never have been exposed to. Yeah. And on the other side of the coin, retention. How do we keep people, engaged and aware and working together, given all of these shifts? I think, you referenced COVID. I think the socialization of young people who missed that time. I don't know how you get that back. I don't know how long it will take before we really understand the effects of some of this.
Yeah.
But as you think about recruitment and retention, how do some of these forces perhaps work, or what's at play in your mind when you put on your employer hat and think about those two important parts of running an organization?
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk really briefly about like onboarding, because there's that interesting little bridge between recruitment and retention, which is how do you set people up for success? Because in one of the studies that we did, one of the things that we found is that a young person's decision to leave an organization is directly tied to their first performance review. And so there's something kind of going on in these performance reviews that is making young talent feel paralyzed instead of motivated. And I think some of that is connected to how in those very early days, so I'll talk about recruitment in a moment, but they're recruited, they're in, and one of the best tools for retention is having people feel like they are and can be successful, that they are set up to win in this organization. Because they want to be productive. People like the fatigue from rigor. They like working hard towards something that matters. And so just like you said, with COVID, there was a little bit of this gap in figuring out how exactly do we do that. So you rewind 10, 15 years in onboarding, there was a big tech focus in onboarding of like, how do we make sure that people can really leverage the technology that we have and use our systems appropriately? You've got a younger generation coming in that's very tech literate, but some of the other skills are a little bit delayed. Some of those communication skills and some of those other, and I hate, soft skills, but essential skills, let's call them that. And really focusing on that. Like, how do you get your idea into the right wrapping paper so that people can actually hear it? So that if you have an idea, you can move it from ideation to execution in a more meaningful way. You can get young people to get some wins under their belt. That really helps with retention. In onboarding, doing some training or conversation around emotional regulation. One of the biggest complaints that I hear from managers and leaders today, and I will be honest, like introspective complaints from young people themselves, is around emotional dysregulation, is kind of this confusion around, should I bring my whole self to work or should I bring my best self? And how do I decipher between those two versions of me? And so having conversations about that, about what does the situation demand of you right now and how do you rise to that occasion? What are some of the tools that you can utilize? So I would say that that is a piece that we're not thinking critically enough about, is how do we set people up for success? Because that can help so much with retention and getting discretionary effort. On the recruitment side, I will say that I think a little bit of like an under-leveraged piece, but more organizations are tapping into this now, particularly in something like manufacturing and more trades-driven industries, is there is this big like fear of becoming obsolete that exists in today's youth culture. Artificial intelligence it's a huge topic of conversation, not only in high schools, but also in colleges. And unlike previous versions of tech, where it was the positioning was very much, how do we partner with this to be more efficient? Like that is not the conversation now. The conversation is a lot of people aren't going to be needed. And we're seeing that in rates of hiring. So even though America's unemployment rate is low, the hiring rate is very low. So like if you're laid off today, it's a tricky time to be laid off, even though unemployment is low. So I say that to say, you got some of these industries where they're undisruptible in that way of that real hands-on work, that very people-driven work.
Yeah.
So I think from a recruitment perspective, I think that is a great entry point. And then also properly leveraging this friendship-like dynamic between parents and kids. Like Gen X parents and Gen Z kids are highly influential over each other's decision-making and purchasing behavior. And this has had a big impact on recruitment because, when an organization makes an offer to a candidate, rightfully so, they're very focused on what is that candidate going to be interested in. It's maybe PTO policy, culture, opportunities for growth and development. But their parents might be like, what's the dental plan? Or what, they might have a different set of concerns. And the parents are playing a really integral role in vetting those employment opportunities. So all sales are intergenerational. And recruitment is sales. And so I think there's that could be leveraged as well, of how do we ensure that these influencers, mom and dad, who are impacting our pipeline, how are their concerns being proactively addressed so that they can help us tip the scales in our direction?
A lot of our clients are associations or industry coalitions. And obviously, we do a lot of this kind of work with large employers, right? When we're working with a large employer, oftentimes this work that we are asked to do, if it's a talent attraction campaign, for example, it's really the first time marketing or communications and HR has worked together at the enterprise level, which is, it's a very interesting dynamic. These are people who see each other a lot, may go to lunch together a lot, but may not have worked together very much. And it can create some challenging circumstances to navigate, or at least some turbulence in that air. And then when we work with associations or coalitions, you see a lot of churn in leadership positions on boards or committees. And I think it can be disruptive to this effort. I guess where I'm going with all of this is I feel like our team is a little bit ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
In terms of the types of work that we do. And an example of that is, I think, when you look at an HR department in a large employer, it's very common to see talent attraction executives or managers or teams. I think in the not too distant future, we're going to see the emergence of talent retention teams inside of those organizations. Right now, that responsibility is really left to the manager or supervisor. And so that interpersonal dynamic can have a profound effect on someone's happiness or desire to stay or leave a particular organization. So when you think about those pieces, those dynamics within employers and within sort of associations that are looking to try to address some of these challenges proactively, what's some advice that comes to mind?
Well, I think you guys are doing a very good job and in opening those lines of communication between HR and marketing. Um, Partly because you don't want talent to feel like they were given a bait and switch. And so I would say like that is one of the takeaways of ensuring that the messaging that you're giving to potential candidates is actually reflective of what your HR policies are, what your pathways for growth and development actually are, because you'll lose talent left and right if they were sold one story and something else was delivered. I also think kind of a takeaway that Danny, I know you and I have talked about is that I like how you're saying this of these like talent retention teams, because you can't untangle retention from recruitment, because some of your best recruitment pipelines come from the people in your workforce who love it. And that's what retention is. It isn't just like, will you stay, don't leave, it isn't that. It's what are the levers that need to be pulled in order to get more discretionary effort from you, to get more engagement, more innovation, more enthusiasm from you, because that, birds of a feather flock together. If you've got a team of great workers who really support your vision and your mission and your way of working, they can bring other people in. And so and we've had conversations about this siloed effect. And so I would say from a takeaway perspective, breaking down those silos, because if you in the organization they are siloed, the reality is outside the organization, they are entangled in one another. It's still all connected of onboarding and HR and marketing and recruitment and retention. All of these things work together outside of your workforce. And so the more that they can work together inside your workforce, the better not only can you sell a cohesive message, but one that actually reflects what you are doing. And then you can properly leverage the enthusiastic talent that you already have to get better talent in the door.
Now that's brilliant. So if I were to say to you, what is the question you wish I had asked, but I didn't? What would be the answer that you might have provided to that question?
I'm only bringing this up because it's been an area that I have been so interested in right now, is kind of the preview into Gen Alpha. I like the question of like, what are some of these early trends that you are seeing with teenagers? So I will answer that because I think it's interesting, and I think we're kind of going to see some changes in the workforce and the talent market and things like that. But also for those of you listening who have kids, I think it's an interesting piece to look at. One of the big pieces that we're studying right now is the end of phone-based childhoods, and I actually think that Gen Alpha is going to have Gen Z to really thank for this. When we look at the movement away from technology at such a young age, a lot of that energy is not coming from parents. It's coming from Gen Zers who are paving the way in a meaningful way for this discussion. The average Gen Zer got their first smartphone when they were 11 and they wish they didn't. And so it's interesting how they're shaping this conversation, not only in schools, right? We've got 8 states so far that have passed legislation to create no phones in schools. We also look at like what wealthy millennial parents do. We start kind of looking at the behaviors of the rich and then understanding what kind of funnels down from there. But with rich millennial parents, we're seeing from a education perspective, there's a real uptick in Montessori and Reggio pedagogies for their children. For a long time, we talked about the digital divide, and what that digital divide used to be was that children growing up in wealthier families had access to technology, and that was seen as a pro. And then children in poor families didn't have this access, and that was bad. And so technology companies funneled into schools to help kind of lift that digital divide. The digital divide now is actually opposite, where children growing up in wealthier families have less tech, and children growing up in poor families have more tech. And we've kind of switched what we think of as positive and negative childhood environments. And so it's hard to know like what impact does this have, but in some ways this reclaiming of childhood, it will just have these ripple effects on not only on the economy, but on creativity, on family dynamics, all of these things. So that's a big piece that I'm looking at. The other is the mental health conversation, which has just been such a big part of the Gen Z environment. But we're now in a place where we're really reevaluating the interventions that were put into place to address adolescent mental health. So one of the biggest studies that I thought was very interesting was done out of the UK, Dr. Saxby, and it was 2,000 eighth graders in the UK, and half of them were put into a program about mental health, like a curriculum, and half of them were not. And the mental health curriculum, is focused on signs of anxiety and depression and how to combat that and who to talk to and some mindfulness techniques and things like that. And then even a year later, the eighth graders who were exposed to that curriculum, they ended up having worse mental health outcomes. They had worse relationships with their parents. Very unfortunately, they had higher rates of reported self-harm. And so I think it's positive that we're because everyone has good intentions with it. Like, I want to be very clear that no one is like, how can we hurt children? It's like the mental health crisis is real, and people are trying to put interventions into place to address this. But we're just at a moment of making sure that we're evaluating for effectiveness. And eighth grade minds, very developmentally appropriately, are prone to rumination. And so we're trying to figure out what is the right time to actually introduce this conversation in a way that doesn't spiral a young mind. And so I think that's going to be interesting in the K through 12 environment, how we kind of empower children, build up some of that resiliency. And again, I think all of those things have interesting impacts. But I think a reevaluation around youth mental health, along with kind of the end of a phone-based childhood, are going to have really interesting impacts on the next generation, which ends up impacting everything, the workforce and the marketplace and families and all of that.
Well, what you're describing hits pretty close to home for me. I have a senior and an eighth grader. And
so you've got your own focus group.
No, focus group. I have a lot of bosses. I get a lot of unsolicited advice, but I think what you're speaking to really hits home for parents trying to figure out how best to parent in this environment. And it's interesting to hear you talk about parenting from different generations. And it's just, I wish there was a Cliff Notes version to how to do this. Parenting for dummies is a real thing, but I don't know how helpful it really is. I just wish there was a yellow brick road sometimes. But you are a wealth of information and knowledge, and I just thank you for sharing all of that with us today. If you would come back and join us again in the future, we would love it. Could you share with listeners how they might learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, probably the best place to follow along is I write Kids These Days on Substack, and that's where my newer stuff is always placed, and you can always feel free to reach out. I love hearing what's on people's minds and your own stories, and everyone does kind of have their own focus groups going on, whether it's at work or with family, and so it's nice to hear from people about the challenges, the opportunities, the things that excite them and concern them. So that's a place to find me.
Well, that's great. Well, Kim, thank you so much for being here today. It is great to see you again. It really is. I look forward to staying in good, close touch. We'd love to have you back on TalentWise. Hope everyone listening at home or your office or on your commute will reach out to Kim or at least learn more about her work. Thanks so
for
much.
having me.